the spring of 2011, the Arrowhead Valley did not drown. By every metric, every forecast, and every law of hydrology, it should have. A late May storm dropped 4.2 inches of warm rain onto a snowpack that was already 185% of the 30-year average. The United States Geological Survey station, 12 miles upstream from the town of Jericho, registered a flow rate that statisticians called a 100-year event. It sent a churning, debris-filled wall of water down the narrow canyon, aimed directly at the 812 souls living in the valley floor. But the flood broke. Just below the Thorne Ranch, where the valley widened slightly, the water's momentum faltered, its crest fell by a critical 14 inches, and the town was saved. The reason it broke was 2,400 acres of old-growth ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and lodgepole that one man had refused to sell. Every other rancher believed that timber was a liability. Elias Thorne believed it was an anchor. Let me tell you about the deal, because the deal is where the story begins. It was the autumn of 1998. The ranchers of the Arrowhead Valley gathered in the Jericho Community Hall, a drafty building erected in 1952 with funds from a bake sale and a cattle lottery. There were 47 of them in the room, men whose faces were maps of sun and worry. They ran cattle on spreads that ranged from a few hundred acres to a few thousand, land that had been in their families since the Homestead Act. And they were worried. The news from up north, from the forests in British Columbia and the Idaho Panhandle, was bad. The mountain pine beetle, an insect no bigger than a grain of rice, was on the move. Warming winters meant the larvae were surviving in record numbers, and vast swaths of timber, millions of acres, were turning red and then gray as the trees died. It was a slow-motion plague, and it was heading their way. Into this room of quiet anxiety walked Mark Caldwell. He was 38 years old, had an MBA from Stanford University, and worked as a senior acquisitions consultant for Northwest Timber Holdings out of Bozeman. He wore a crisp shirt, no tie, and carried a leather briefcase. He didn't look like a man who had ever stretched his own fence or pulled a calf in a blizzard, and he wasn't. He was a man of numbers, of projections, of risk mitigation strategies. He set up a projector and a screen, and for the next 90 minutes he explained the future to the men in the room. His presentation was flawless. It was filled with charts showing the exponential spread of the beetle infestation. It had graphs illustrating the inevitable collapse of timber prices once the market was flooded with salvaged deadfall. He showed them satellite imagery overlaid with infestation probability models. The conclusion was stark, logical, and terrifying. Their timber, the forests that climbed the slopes above their grazing lands, was not an asset. It was a liability, a time bomb of depreciation. "Gentlemen," Caldwell said, his voice calm and reasonable, "what you have on your hillsides is a savings account that is actively losing value. The beetles are coming. That is not a guess. It is a statistical certainty. When they arrive, the value of your timber will plummet. The cost of salvage logging will eat whatever profit is left. You will be left with a fire hazard and a tax burden." Then came the solution. Northwest Timber Holdings was making a one-time, valley-wide offer. They would pay a premium, a price based on the pre-infestation market. They would clear-cut all merchantable timber over 8 inches in diameter. The price was $1,250 per acre. For Dave Jensen, whose ranch bordered the Thorne place to the east, that meant a check for $937,500 for his 750 acres of timberland. For the valley as a whole, it was an injection of nearly $22 million. Caldwell clicked to his final slide. It showed a rancher, smiling, leaning against a brand-new John Deere tractor. This is an opportunity to liquidate an at-risk asset and reinvest in your core business, he said. Upgrade your equipment, pay down your debt, secure your family's future. It's the smart move. It's the only move. The room was quiet for a moment, the hum of the projector fan filling the space. Then the questions started. But they weren't questions of defiance. They were questions of logistics. How soon could the loggers start? How were the payments structured? The deal was all but done. The logic was inescapable. Only one man didn't raise his hand. Elias Thorne sat in the back row, his hands resting on his knees. He was 72 years old that year, had been running the Thorne Ranch for 51 of them. He had taken it over from his father, who had taken it over from his, the man who had filed the original claim in 1888 with a signature and a $20 gold piece. Elias was known for two things: the quality of his Hereford cattle and his profound silence. He listened to Caldwell's entire presentation without a flicker of expression on his face, his posture unchanging. After the meeting, as men gathered in small groups to talk in excited, nervous tones, Caldwell made his way to the back of the room. He was a good salesman. He knew you had to close every lead. "Mr. Thorne," he said, extending a hand. "Mark Caldwell. I noticed you didn't have any questions. I hope my presentation was clear." Elias looked at Caldwell's hand for a moment before taking it. His grip was dry and firm, the skin like old leather. "It was clear," Elias said. His voice was low and gravelly. "You want to buy our trees. I want to help you realize their value before it's gone," Caldwell corrected smoothly. "Your ranch has, if my maps are correct, 2,400 acres of timber. At our offered rate, that's a $3 million check. That's a significant sum." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze drifting past Caldwell to the window, where the last light of day was catching the tops of the mountains that cradled the valley. "It is," he said. "But the value isn't in the selling. The value is in the standing." Caldwell smiled, a patient, professional smile. "I understand the sentiment, I do, but the data suggests—" "Your data," Elias interrupted, his voice still quiet but with a new edge of iron, "is about the price of a 2x4. My data is about the depth of the snow and the color of the water in the creek in June. They're not the same thing." He turned and walked out of the hall, leaving Mark Caldwell standing alone, a man who had just successfully sold 17,000 acres of timber, but had failed to convince the one man who owned the most critical piece of the puzzle. Let me tell you about the Thorne Ranch. It wasn't the biggest in the valley, but it was the highest. It sat at the head of the canyon, where the Arrowhead River was still just a collection of snow-fed creeks. The 2,400 acres of timber Caldwell wanted were the watershed for the entire valley. Elias's grandfather, a stern man from the Black Forest of Germany, had understood this in his bones. He had taught Elias's father a single, unbreakable rule, and Elias's father had taught it to him. The rule was written in the front of the old ranch ledger, a book bound in cracked leather that held 110 years of rainfall measurements, cattle prices, and family births and deaths. The rule was, the water follows the trees, and the trees hold the land. You sell one, you lose the other two. To the Thornes, the forest was not a crop. It was infrastructure. The other ranchers didn't see it that way. They saw Elias as a stubborn old fool, a man letting sentiment get in the way of progress. His neighbor, Dave Jensen, came to see him a week later. They sat at the heavy oak table in Elias's kitchen, a table his grandfather had built from a single ponderosa felled on the property. "Elias," Dave said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. He was 68 years old and had known Elias his entire life. "The whole valley is signing on. We could get a better price if we all go in together. Caldwell says a unified block is more efficient for his logging crews." "I'm not selling, Dave," Elias said. "But why? It's $3 million. Think what you could do. You could fix up this old place. Lord knows it needs it. You could put in a pivot irrigation system, double your hay yield." "The hay does fine," Elias said. "You're thinking about the beetles, aren't you? Thinking you can fight 'em." Dave shook his head. "You can't. It's like trying to stop the tide. They're coming. In 5, maybe 10 years, that forest of yours is going to be a ghost town of dead trees. Then it'll be worth nothing." "A standing dead tree still has roots," Elias said, more to himself than to Dave. "Roots still hold the soil." The conversation was repeated in different forms over the next few months. Even Elias's grandson, Ben, tried to reason with him. Ben was 22, fresh out of Montana State with a degree in agricultural business. He came home full of ideas about efficiency, futures markets, and maximizing return on assets. He saw the logic in Caldwell's proposal. "Grandpa," he said one evening, spreading a copy of the Northwest Timber Holdings contract on the oak table, "I've run the numbers. Even if we invest the $3 million in conservative bonds, the annual return would be over $120,000. That's more than the cattle operation clears in a good year. We could hire help. We could travel. You wouldn't have to work so hard." Elias looked at his grandson, a boy he had taught to ride and fish. He saw the good intentions. He also saw the classroom logic, the clean certainty of a spreadsheet that didn't have a column for 100-year floods. He walked over to a bookshelf and pulled down the old ranch ledger. He opened it to a page in the back. It was a hand-drawn map of the ranch, annotated in his father's spidery script. It showed the springs, the seeps, the areas where the snow lay deepest in the winter. "This is the ranch's engine," Elias said, his finger tracing the forested slopes. "It catches the snow. It holds the water. It meters it out all summer. The trees are the regulators on that engine. You pull them all out at once, the engine floods. Then it rusts. Then it dies." Ben argued. He talked about modern reseeding techniques, about erosion control blankets, about the contractual obligation for the timber company to replant seedlings. Elias listened patiently. When Ben was finished, he closed the ledger and put it back on the shelf. "They will plant seedlings," he said, "but they can't plant a forest floor. They can't plant 50 years of fallen needles that hold the water like a sponge. They can't plant shade." The argument was over. Ben was frustrated, convinced his grandfather was sacrificing their financial future for a romantic, outdated notion of nature. He loved the old man, but he thought he was wrong. The logging began the next summer, in 1999. For 3 years, the valley was filled with the sound of chainsaws and the rumble of logging trucks. The clear cuts spread across the hillsides like a disease, vast patches of brown earth where green had been. Dust clouds rose behind the trucks on the gravel roads. The Arrowhead River ran cloudy with silt for the first time anyone could remember. The ranchers who had sold received their checks. New pickups appeared in driveways. New barns and metal sheds went up. Mark Caldwell was praised at the cafe in Jericho as the man who had saved the valley from financial ruin. The Thorne Ranch became an island of green in a sea of brown. The loggers cut right up to Elias's fence line. On one side stood a dense, multi-generational forest, its floor a thick carpet of needles and decaying wood. On the other was a landscape of stumps, skid trails, and bare, compacted soil. The contrast was brutal. People would drive up the valley road just to look at it, shaking their heads at the old man's stubbornness. Then, just as Caldwell had predicted, the beetles came. It started in 2004. A few patches of red appeared high on the slopes of the thorn forest. By 2006, entire hillsides were dotted with the ghostly gray of dead pines. It was a terrible sight. Dave Jensen drove over one afternoon and found Elias standing on a ridge, looking out at the dead trees. "I'm sorry to see it, Elias," Dave said, his voice genuine. "I truly am. You held out for nothing." Elias just nodded. "They're dead," he said, "but they're not gone." The next year, Elias and Ben started a different kind of logging. They didn't clear-cut. They went in with a small, agile skidder, a machine that could weave between living trees. They selectively harvested the deadfall. They took only what they needed for firewood, for fence posts, for a few small custom milling jobs. They were careful to leave the root systems intact. They left most of the standing dead trees alone. They created small clearings, no more than an acre or two, that allowed sunlight to hit the forest floor. In those clearings, aspen and fir seedlings, which had been waiting patiently in the understory, began to shoot up. Ben, who was now 31 and running the day-to-day operations, began to understand. He saw that the forest wasn't just a collection of pines. It was a complex system of ponderosa, Douglas fir, larch, aspen, and cottonwood. The beetles only targeted the mature pines. The other species were untouched. By creating small openings, his grandfather was accelerating the forest's natural process of regeneration and diversification. It wasn't the clean, efficient plantation of seedlings the timber company had planted on the other ranches, many of which had withered and died on the sun-baked, nutrient-poor soil. It was a messy, chaotic, but living thing. Let me tell you about the forest floor, because it's the most important character in this story. On the clear-cut lands, the floor was gone. The heavy logging equipment had compacted the soil into a hard pan. The sun had baked it. The wind and rain had stripped the thin layer of topsoil away, carrying it down into the creeks. When it rained, the water hit the ground and ran off immediately, as if on a paved street. On the Thorne Ranch, the floor was a living entity, a deep, absorbent layer called duff. It was composed of decades, centuries of fallen needles, leaves, cones, and branches in various states of decay. It was up to a foot deep in places, a rich, black, spongy mass teeming with mycelial networks, insects, and microorganisms. When rain fell or snow melted, it didn't run off. It soaked in. The duff layer on Elias Thorne's 2,400 acres could hold, by a conservative estimate from a Forest Service hydrologist who later studied it, over 1.5 billion gallons of water.
It was a reservoir, a buffer, a break, and nobody had ever put a price on it. The winter of 2010 to 2011 was one for the record books. The snow started in October and didn't stop. By April, the snowpack in the mountains above the Arrowhead Valley was measured at 185% of the 30-year median. Old-timers looked at the mountains and felt a familiar dread. They remembered 1964, the last great flood, which had put 2 feet of water in the Jericho General Store. But this was worse. The snowpack was 30% higher than it had been in '64. The spring came on fast and hot. In the 3rd week of May, a warm weather system moved in from the Pacific. It was what meteorologists call a rain-on-snow event, the perfect recipe for a catastrophic flood. The temperature jumped to 70 degrees, and the rain began to fall. Not a gentle spring shower, but a relentless, driving downpour. For 72 hours, it rained on the saturated, melting snow. On the clear-cut hillsides that surrounded the valley, the effect was immediate and devastating. The water, with nowhere to go, sheeted off the bare earth. It carved deep gullies, taking millions of tons of soil with it. The small tributary creeks, which normally ran clear and gentle, transformed into raging brown torrents. They ripped out culverts and tore at the banks, carrying a slurry of mud, rock, and logging debris down toward the Arrowhead River. On the Thorne Ranch, something entirely different was happening. The forest canopy intercepted nearly 1/3 of the rainfall, which then evaporated back into the atmosphere. The rain that did reach the ground fell onto the deep duff layer, which absorbed it like a trillion tiny-celled sponge. The snow that melted underneath the trees did so more slowly, shielded from the direct rain and warm wind. The water that eventually made its way into the creeks was filtered and released slowly, steadily, over hours and days instead of minutes. The creeks running off Elias Thorne's land were high, but they ran relatively clear. They were swollen, not cataclysmic. His forest was performing its ancient, uninvoiced, and unaccounted-for job. It was regulating the engine. Down in Jericho, the town was preparing for the worst. The National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning, predicting a crest of 14 feet at the Jericho Bridge. Major flood stage was 10 feet. A 14-foot crest would inundate the entire historic downtown and the first 3 blocks of the residential area south of the river. Sheriff's deputies went door to door, issuing a mandatory evacuation order for the flood zone. People moved furniture to second floors, stacked sandbags with a grim sense of futility, and then drove their cars to higher ground. By 8 p.m. on the second day of the storm, most of the town had gathered on the high ground near the bridge. It was a primal, hypnotic thing to watch. The Arrowhead River was no longer a river. It was a monster. It was 200 yards wide, 10 times its normal breadth, and filled with whole trees, mangled fence posts, and other debris that churned in the violent, muddy current. The sound was a constant, deafening roar. Elias Thorne was there, standing next to his truck. He was 85 years old now, frailer than he had been, but his eyes were clear. Ben stood beside him. They didn't speak. They just watched. Dave Jensen was there, his face pale. His ranch had lost nearly its entire riverbank, and 2 of his prize bulls had been swept away. He stood near Elias, but he couldn't bring himself to look at the old man. Mark Caldwell was there too. By a strange twist of fate, he was back in the valley,
scouting a new potential timber purchase in the next county over. He was stuck in Jericho until the flood subsided. He stood with a group of ranchers, a portable tablet in his hand, displaying the USGS river gauge data.
"It's a textbook 100-year event," he said to the men around him, his voice still carrying that air of calm, analytical authority. "The models are very clear on this. We're looking at a 14-foot crest, maybe 14.2. It's a tragedy, but it's an act of God, statistically unavoidable." The river gauge, a solar-powered electronic sensor, transmitted its readings in real time. A large digital display had been set up by the fire department. Every eye was on it. 11.6 feet, 12.2 feet, 12.9 feet. The water was now licking at the bottom of the bridge's steel girders. The roar seemed to grow louder with every tenth of a foot. 13.5 feet. The water was over the banks, creeping into the parking lot of the feed store. 13.8 feet. This was the moment of truth. The predictive models all showed a rapid, final surge from here to above 14 feet as the peak flow from the upper tributaries arrived. The town held its breath. And then something happened. Or rather, something failed to happen. The number on the display held. For 10 minutes it flickered between 13.8 and 13.9. The furious rise had stopped. The river was still a terrifying spectacle, but the rate of increase had vanished. Caldwell was staring at his tablet, frowning. He refreshed the data feed. "That's not right," he muttered. "There must be a sensor malfunction." But it wasn't a malfunction. The water lapped at the sandbags in front of the Jericho General Store, inches from the doorway. It filled the cellar of the church, but it went no higher. The peak flow had arrived, but it was not the cataclysm the models had predicted. It was as if a giant invisible hand had reached down and throttled back the flood. The upstream reservoir of the thorn forest, the great sponge, had absorbed the punch. It had taken the sharp, deadly peak of the flood curve and flattened it, spreading the runoff over a longer period. It had done its job. The river crested at 13.9 feet. It held there for nearly an hour, a trembling, overfull vessel. Then, slowly, painfully, the number began to drop. 13.8, 13.7. A collective sigh went through the crowd, a sound of exhausted, disbelieving relief. The monster was receding. The town was saved. In the quiet that followed, a strange thing happened. People didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They turned, almost as one, and looked at the old man standing by his truck. They looked at Elias Thorne. They saw the 2,400 acres of dark, wet forest standing sentinel at the head of their valley. And for the first time, they understood what it was. It wasn't a failed asset. It was a shield. Dave Jensen walked over to Elias, his boots crunching on the wet gravel. He stood before his old neighbor, and the look on his face was one of profound, gut-wrenching comprehension. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. He just shook his head, turned, and walked away. Mark Caldwell was still looking at his tablet, cross-referencing rainfall data with flow rates. The numbers didn't add up. The runoff coefficient was impossibly low. His perfect logical model had failed because it was missing the single most important variable.
the hydrological function of a mature, intact, multi-generational forest ecosystem. His system had accounted for the price of every tree, but not the value of the forest. The irony was devastating. The man of numbers had been defeated by a single, unpredicted number: 13.9. The aftermath played out over years, a slow and quiet lesson in ecology and economics. The town of Jericho was spared, but the valley was deeply wounded. The clear-cut ranches suffered catastrophic soil erosion. The Forest Service estimated that some slopes had lost over 1,000 tons of topsoil per acre, a loss that would take centuries to replace.
The money the ranchers had made from the timber sale was spent on remediation, on rebuilding washed-out roads, on trying to stabilize collapsing hillsides. Replanting efforts failed. The seedlings couldn't survive on the sterile subsoil that was left behind. The grazing was poor. The creeks, once prime trout streams, were choked with silt. Within a decade, nearly half of the ranches that had sold their timber had been sold off entirely, broken up into 20-acre hobby farms for out-of-staters. The community fabric that had existed for a century was torn apart. The Thorne Ranch, however, thrived. The floodwaters had barely disturbed its banks. The creek ran clear again within a week. The forest, invigorated by the moisture and the new openings in the canopy, flourished. The diversity of species made it resilient to future blights. The grazing land below it, nourished by clean, steady water, was richer than ever. Elias Thorne passed away 2 years after the flood, at the age of 87. He died in the same bed his father had died in the house his grandfather had built. Ben took over the ranch, but he was no longer just a rancher. He was a steward. He managed the forest with a reverence he hadn't understood as a young man. He continued his grandfather's practice of selective, sustainable harvesting, and every day he made an entry in the old leather ledger, recording the rainfall, the creek level, the health of the trees. He was tending to the ranch's engine. True wealth is not a number in a bank account. It is a functioning system in a world that is constantly trying to break it. An ecosystem is not a portfolio of assets to be liquidated one by one. It is a single, interwoven thing. Its value cannot be calculated by adding up the price of its parts. Its value lies in the synergy of the whole. What is rigid breaks. What is uniform is fragile. What survives is what is diverse and deep-rooted and has learned the wisdom of patience. Sometimes the smartest financial decision, the one that ensures the most valuable inheritance, is to stand in the face of all reasonable advice and do nothing at all.